Okay, you ready for the last part of the last chapter? Okay, so let's read the letter again that he received while he was sitting. Remember, he's just woken up, and his servant is standing there, which is really kind of creepy, but and he's got some letters, and he looks at the letters, and oh my goodness, one is from Yorkshire. I don't recognize this person's handwriting. So he reads it, and it says, "Dear Sir, I am Susan Sowerby, that made so bold to speak to you once on the moor. It was about Miss Mary that I spoke. I will make bold to speak again. Please, sir, I would come home if I was you. I think you would be glad to come, and, if you will excuse me, sir, I think your lady would ask you to come if she was here. Your obedient servant, Susan Sowerby." Mr. Craven read the letter twice before he put it back in its envelope. He kept thinking about that dream. "I will go back to Misselthwaite," he said, "and I will go at once." He went through the garden to the villa and ordered Pitcher to prepare for his return to England. In a few days, he was in Yorkshire again, and on his long railroad journey, he found himself thinking of his boy as he had never thought in all the 10 years past. During those years, he had only wished to forget him. Now, though he did not intend to think about him, memories of him constantly drifted into his mind. He remembered the black days when he had raved like a madman because the child was alive and the mother was dead. He had refused to see it, and when he had gone to look at it at last, it had been such a weak, wretched thing that everyone had been sure that it would die in a few days. But, to the surprise of those who took care of it, the days passed and it lived, and then everyone believed it would be deformed and crippled, a deformed and crippled creature. Wow, those are strong words, aren't they, boys and girls? Did you notice, and I bet you did you notice how he used the word it instead of the pronoun he or him? He said he remembered those days when he was so upset because the child lived but the mother died. He had refused to see it. And when he had gone to look at it at last, it had been such a weak, wretched thing that everyone had been sure it would die in a few days. But to the surprise of those who took care of it, the days passed and it lived. And then everyone believed it would be a deformed and crippled creature. It. Isn't that crazy? But you know, boys and girls, remember the beginning of this chapter when they said that thoughts can be as strong as, what was it compared to? Thoughts can be as strong as powerful as electric batteries, it says. Well, you know, he filled his mind with ideas that this child was weak, that this child was going to be crippled. And then they kind of taught him those ideas. And look at what happened. He had not meant to be a bad father, but he had not felt like a father at all. He had supplied doctors and nurses and luxuries, but he had shrank from the mere thought of the boy and had buried himself in his own misery. The first time, after a year's absence, he returned to Misselthwaite, and the small, miserable-looking thing languidly and indifferently lifted to his face the great gray eyes with black lashes round them, so like and horribly unlike the happy eyes he adored from Colin's mom. He could not bear the sight of them and turned away, pale as death. After that, he scarcely ever saw him except when he was asleep, and all he knew of him was that he was a confirmed invalid with a vicious, hysterical, half-insane temper. He could only be kept from furies dangerous to himself by being given his own way in every detail. All of this was not an uplifting thing to recall. But as the train whirled him through the mountain passes and golden plains, the man who was coming alive began to think in a new way, and he thought long and steady and deeply. Perhaps I have been wrong for 10 years, he said to himself. 10 years is a long time, and it may be too late to do anything. Quite too late. But what have I been thinking of? Of course, this was the wrong magic to begin by saying too late. Even Colin could have told him that, but he knew nothing of magic, either black or white. This he had yet to learn. He wondered if Susan Sowerby had taken courage and written to him only because the motherly creature had realized that the boy was much worse, maybe fatally ill. So Mr. Craven's thinking, did she write to me because it's a good thing, or did she write to me because maybe the boy is going to die? If he had not been under the spell of the curious calmness which had taken possession of him, he would have been more wretched than ever. But the calm had brought a sort of courage and hope with it. Instead of giving way to thoughts of the worst, he actually found that he was trying to believe in better things. Could it be possible that she sees that I may be able to do him good and control him? He thought. I will go and see her on my way to Misselthwaite. But when on his way across the moor he stopped the carriage at the cottage, 7 or 8 children who were playing about gathered in a group and bobbing 7 or 8 friendly and polite curtsies told him that their mother had gone to the other side of the moor early in the morning to help a woman who had a new baby. Our Dickon, they volunteered, was over at the manor working in one of the gardens, where he went several days a week. Mr. Craven looked over the collection of sturdy little bodies and round red-cheeked faces, each one grinning in its own particular way, and he awoke to the fact that they were a healthy, likable lot. He smiled at their friendly grins and took a golden souvenir from his pocket and gave it to our Elizabeth Ellen, who was the oldest. If you divide that into 8 parts, there will be half a crown for each of you. Division! Then, amid grins and chuckles and bobbing of curtsies, he drove away, leaving ecstasy and nudging elbows and little jumps of joy behind. So what did he give them, boys and girls? He gave them a coin, like he gave them a gold piece. So, like, think of it as money. So he drives away and there's little jumps of joy behind him. The drive across the wonderfulness of the moor was a soothing thing. Why did it seem to give him a sense of homecoming, which he had been sure he could never feel again? That sense of the beauty of land and sky, and purple bloom of distance and a warming of the heart at drawing near to the great old house which had held those of his blood for 600 years. So the great old house which had been in his family for 600 years. How he had driven away from it the last time, shuddering to think of its closed rooms and the boy lying in the 4-poster bed with the brocade hangings. Was it possible that perhaps he might find him changed, a little for the better? Do you hear the woodpecker? Was it possible that perhaps he might find him changed a little for the better, and that he might overcome his shrinking from him? How real that dream had been! How wonderful and clear the voice which had called back to him in the garden. In the garden. I will try to find the key, he said. I will try to open the door. I must, though I don't know why. When he arrived at the manor, the servants who received him with the usual ceremony, noticed that he looked better and that he did not go to the remote rooms where he usually lived, attended by Pitcher. Pitcher, remember, is like his butler, a person who takes care of him. He went into the library and he sent for Mrs. Medlock. She came to him somewhat excited and curious and flustered. "How is Master Colin, Medlock?" he inquired. "Well, sir," Mrs. Medlock answered, he's different, in a manner of speaking." "Worse?" he suggested. Mrs. Medlock was really flushed. "Well, you see, sir," she tried to explain, "neither Dr. Craven nor the nurse nor me can exactly make him out." "Why is that?" "To tell you the truth, sir, Master Craven might be better, and he might be changing for the worse. His appetite, sir, is past understanding, and his ways, has he become more peculiar?" her master asked, knitting his brows anxiously, like he's got those thinking eyebrows. "That's it, sir. He's growing very particular. When you compare him with what he used to be, he used to eat nothing, and then suddenly he began to eat something enormous. And then he stopped again all at once, and the meals were sent back just as they used to be. You never knew, sir, perhaps, that out of doors he never would let himself be taken. The things we've gone through to get him to go out in a chair would leave a body trembling like a leaf. He'd throw himself into such a state that Dr. Craven said he couldn't be responsible for forcing him. Well, sir, just without warning, not long after one of his worst tantrums, he suddenly insisted on being taken out every day by Miss Mary and Susan Sowerby's boy, Dickon, that could push his chair. He took a fancy to both Miss Mary and Dickon brought his tame animals, and if you'll credit it, sir, out of doors he will stay from morning until night." "How does he look?" was the next question. "If he took his food natural, sir, you would think he was putting on flesh. But we're afraid it may be a sort of bloat." She says that because she can't understand how he's getting fat, but he's not eating his food. So they're saying it would be great if he ate his food. We would think he was getting nice and, not fat, but nice and healthy, right? But she's saying he doesn't eat his food, so we're kind of worried that something else is wrong. He laughs sometimes in a queer way when he's alone with Miss Mary. He never used to laugh at all. Dr. Craven is coming to see you at once if you'll allow him. He never was as puzzled in his life." "Where is Master Colin now?" Mr. Craven asked. "In the garden, sir. He's always in the garden, though not a human creature is allowed to go near for fear they'll look at him." Mr. Craven scarcely heard her words. "In the garden?" he said. And after he had sent Mrs. Medlock away, he stood and repeated it again and again. "In the garden." He had to make an effort to bring himself back to the place he was standing in, and when he felt he was on the earth again, he turned and went out of the room. He took his way, as Mary had done, through the door in the shrubbery and among the laurels and the fountain beds. The fountain was playing now, and it was encircled by beds of brilliant autumn flowers. He crossed the lawn and turned into the long walk by the ivied walls. So, boys and girls, he knows exactly where he's going, doesn't he? He did not walk quickly, but slowly, and his eyes were on the path. He felt as if he were being drawn back to the place that he had so long forsaken, and he did not know why. As he drew nearer to it, his step became still more slow. He knew where the door was, even though the ivy hung thick over it. But he did not know exactly where it lay, that he buried the key. Boys and girls, this is the best part. So he stopped and stood still, looking about him. And almost the moment after he had paused, he startled and listened, asking himself if he were walking in a dream. The ivy hung thick over the door. The key was buried under the shrubs. No human being had passed that portal for 10 lonely years. And yet, inside the garden, there were sounds. They were the sounds of running, scuffling feet, seeming to chase round and round under the trees. They were the strange sounds of lowered, suppressed voices, exclamations, and smothered, joyous cries. Because remember how they try to be quiet so nobody will hear them? It seemed actually like the laughter of young things, the uncontrollable laughter of children who were trying not to be heard, but who, in a moment or so, as their excitement mounted, would burst forth. What in heaven's name did he hear? Was he losing his reason and thinking he heard things which were not for human ears? So he's like, am I going crazy? What was that? The far clear voice, was it that the far clear voice had meant? And when the moment came, the uncontrollable moment when the sounds forgot to hush themselves, the feet ran faster and faster, and they were nearing the garden door. There was quick, strong young breathing and wild outbreak of laughing shouts which could not be contained, and the door in the ivy wall was flung wide open, the sheet of ivy swinging back, and a boy burst through at full speed without even seeing the outsider, and he dashed almost into his arms. Mr. Craven had extended them, his arms, just in time to save him from falling as a result of his unseeing dash against him. And when he held him away to look at him, in amazement at his being there, he truly gasped for breath. He was a tall boy and a handsome one. He was glowing with life, and his running had sent splendid color leaping into his face. He threw the dark hair from his forehead and he threw back the hair from his forehead and lifted a pair of strange gray eyes. Eyes full of boyish laughter and rimmed with black lashes like a fringe. It was the eyes which made Mr. Craven gasp for breath. Who? What? Who? He stammered. This is not what Colin had expected. This was not what he had planned. He had never thought of such a meeting. And yet to come dashing out, winning a race. Perhaps it was even better. He drew himself up to his very tallest. Mary, who had been running with him and had dashed through the door too, believed that he managed to make himself look taller than he ever looked before. Father, he said, I'm Colin. You can't believe it. I scarcely can myself. I'm Colin. Like Mrs. Medlock, he did not understand what his father meant when he said hurriedly, in the garden, in the garden. Yes, hurried on Colin. It was the garden that did it. And Mary and Dickon and the creatures and the magic, no one knows. We kept it to tell you when you came. I'm well. I can beat Mary in a race. I'm going to be an athlete. He said it all so like a healthy boy, his face flushed, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness, that Mr. Craven's soul shook with unbelieving joy. Colin put out his hand and laid it on his father's arm. Aren't you glad, Father? He ended. Aren't you glad? I'm going to live forever and ever and ever. Mr. Craven put his hands on both of the boy's shoulders and held him still. He knew he dared not even try to speak for a moment. "Take me into the garden, my boy," he said at last, "and tell me all about it." And so they led him in. The place was a wilderness of autumn gold and purple and violet blue and flaming scarlet, and on every side were sheaves of late lilies standing together. Lilies which were white or white and ruby. He remembered well when the first of them had been planted, that just at the season of the year their late glories should have revealed themselves. Late roses climbed and hung and clustered in the sunshine, deepening the hue of the yellowing trees, made one feel that one stood in an embowered temple of gold. The newcomers stood silent, just as the children had done when they came into its grayness. He looked around and around. "I thought it would be dead," he said. "Mary thought so at first," said Colin, "but it came alive." Then they sat down under their tree, all but Colin, who wanted to stand while he told his story. It was the strangest thing he had ever heard, Archibald Craven thought, as it was poured forth in headlong boy fashion. Mystery and magic and wild creatures, the weird midnight meeting, the coming of spring, the passion of insulated pride which had dragged the young Rajah to his feet to defy old Ben Weatherstaff to his face. The odd companionship, the play acting, the great secret so carefully kept. The listener laughed until tears came to his eyes, and sometimes tears came to his eyes when he was not laughing. The athlete, the lecturer, the scientific discoverer was a laughable, lovable, healthy, young human being. "Now," he said at the end of the story, "it need not be a secret any more. I dare say it will frighten them nearly into fits when they see me. But I am never going to get into the chair again. I shall walk back with you, Father, to the house." Ben Weatherstaff's duties rarely took him away from the gardens, but on this occasion he made an excuse to carry some vegetables to the kitchen, and being invited into the servants' hall by Mrs. Medlock to drink a glass of beer, he was on the spot, as he would hope to be, when the most dramatic event Misselthwaite Manor had seen during the present generation actually took place. So he's saying he really wanted to be there when Colin finally showed everybody the truth. And he was hoping to be, so he carried those vegetables in, and he was invited to come in. One of the windows looking upon the courtyard gave also a glimpse of the lawn. Mrs. Medlock, knowing Ben had come in from the gardens, hoped that he might have caught a sight of his master, and even by chance of his meeting with Master Colin. "Did you see either of them, Weatherstaff?" she asked. Ben took his beer mug from his mouth and wiped his lips with the back of his hand. "Aye, that I did," he answered in a shrewdly significant air. "Both of them?" suggested Mrs. Medlock. "Both of them," returned Ben Weatherstaff. "Thank ye kindly, madam. I could sup up another mug of it." "Together?" asked Mrs. Medlock, hastily overfilling his beer mug in her excitement. "Together, ma'am." And Ben gulped down half of his new mug in one gulp. "Where was Master Colin? How did he look? What did they say to each other?" "I didn't hear that," said Ben, "along o' only being on the stepladder looking over the wall. But I'll tell thee this, there's been things going on outside as you house people knows not about. And what thou'll find out soon." and it was not 2 minutes before he swallowed the last of his beer and waved his mug solemnly toward the window, which took in through the shrubbery a piece of the lawn. "Look there," he said. "If thou's curious, look what's coming across the grass." When Mrs. Medlock looked, she threw her hands and gave a little shriek, and every man and woman servant within hearing bolted across the servants' hall and stood looking through the window with their eyes almost starting out of their heads. Across the lawn came the master of Misselthwaite, and he looked as many of them had never seen him. And by his side, with his head up in the air and his eyes full of laughter, walked as strongly and steadily as any boy in Yorkshire, Master Colin. Ta-da! Did you love it? Wasn't that the best book? So here's what I challenge you to do. I challenge you to go back and read it again, either now, right after you've just read it, because I guarantee you, if we were to flip back, let's just try this for just a second. If we were to flip back and read the first chapter, I think we would be shocked. I want you to go back and just read the first chapter. And I want you to remember what Mary was like. I challenge you to do that. I think you would love to read it again. But maybe if you're like, "Oh, no, Mrs. Manville, no thanks." Maybe like next year, read it again. Because now that you know the end, it's going to make the beginning even better. I really loved reading that with you. And I wish so much that we could have finished it together because I love the end. And the truth is, boys and girls, third graders change while reading this book just as much as Mary changed in this book and as much as Colin changed. Third graders start to appreciate the author's choices and start to appreciate the ways that we should feel sorry for Colin and Mary, and the ways that sometimes Colin and Mary's behavior irritates us. When third graders first start reading this book, they don't notice those things, but by the end, the third graders have grown just as much as Mary and Colin. And I so wish that we could have been together to read this in our classroom. But I'm just glad that we experienced it together, because I just think this is such a beautiful book that illustrates what kindness and positivity can do for people. That idea of thinking good thoughts makes good things happen. Not right away, but that thinking bad thoughts doesn't make anything good happen. And I just love this story, and I'm so glad to have shared it with you. The next story we're going to read, you are also going to love. I mean, just love. It is not nearly as hard as this book. And so I want you to really be proud of yourselves, boys and girls. This is like a 5th grade book, easily a 5th grade book. That's why there's so many hard words in here, and that's why I have to stop frequently and talk to you about what the author is saying, because it's not a 3rd grade book at all. So you should feel so much pride in yourself that you are capable of understanding it and of learning the lessons that Mary Lennox learned right along with her. I just can't say enough about how proud I am of you guys and how much you're going to love our next book. I hope you loved this one as much as I did. Go ahead and finish up your last comprehension paper for The Secret Garden. We will have a little test to go along with it just to see what you remember of the book. Consider that the AR, oh my gosh, AR. Oh, boys and girls, I haven't changed your AR goals. Oh. Consider that the AR test will be worth taking. And I will work on your AR goals Okay. I'll talk to you soon.